This is BBC1.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Nicholas Witchell and Anna Ford.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. In Peking, the popular protest is growing. At sunset tonight, there were said to be nearly 500,000 people in the city centre. The summit continues regardless. The Soviet Union and China have sealed a new era of friendship. Here, the government has won the fight over the poll tax leaflet, but lost a vote in Brussels over who should write a health warning for smokers. How a new drug called a clotbuster could save thousands of heart attack victims. And the explorer who's walked to both ends of the earth. For the second day running in Peking, diplomatic achievement has shared the stage with mass popular protest. The crowd in Tiananmen Square in the centre of Peking has now grown to several 100,000 strong. And today the students were joined by thousands of workers from many different walks of Chinese life. Together they called for change, for a new era of democracy in their country, and they shouted the name of their hero, President Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. He was inside the Great Hall of the People with China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. They were discussing change of the kind which statesmen favour, a new era of friendship between the communist superpowers. The BBC's Asia correspondent, Brian Barron, now describes another remarkable day in the Chinese capital.
It seemed like the smooth climax of masterful diplomacy. From the left, the Soviet bear, from the right, the Chinese dragon, shaking hands for 30 seconds to signal 3 decades of strain and suspicion are supposedly over. But on the very doorstep of this momentous encounter was bedlam. Because Tiananmen Square is, for the moment, the property of students demanding democratic change. So plans for Mr. Gorbachev to lay a wreath at this monument were hastily abandoned. Communist officials fumed at what they term the negative impact on China's dignity of these scenes. For 4 days, the activists have defiantly camped out on the Communist Party's most hallowed ground. Today, the government ordered teachers to persuade the students to return to their classrooms. That misfired.
The government, actually, they are warning the workers, warning the teachers, but now I think the situation in Beijing is out of government's control now.
A few yards away, inside the Great Hall of the People, the government was in emergency session. And in another part of the same building, the Sino-Soviet summit was beginning, with China's senior leader, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, greeting Comrade Gorbachev, almost within earshot of the unrest in the square outside. The session for photographers was brief, though revealing. The 84-year-old Chinese statesman stuttered and slurred words, and at one point appeared to forget Mr. Gorbachev's name. Publicly, at least, the student unrest on the very doorstep of this summit seemed the great unmentionable. The two leaders did discuss Cambodia in detail, and later the Chinese said they'd failed to reach agreement on a settlement. There was a banquet lunch with the architect of perestroika showing a dexterous touch with his chopsticks. Mr. Deng seems worn by the cares of office. During this trip, Mrs. Gorbachev has been very much in the background, but there was a snap for the history books. This was the one moment of the day when the Soviet president was able to meet ordinary Chinese. He did a brief walkabout after lunch, well away from the student unrest in the heart of Peking. By mid-afternoon in Tiananmen Square, the baking sun was felling the hunger strikers. In an admirable display of self-sufficiency, those suffering from heat stroke and dehydration were treated by Peking medical students. After days of being ignored most of the time by the state media, an official TV team turned up to record the comradeship. It's remarkable that in nearly 1 month of demonstrations, often involving crowds of over 100,000 people, there have been no serious casualties. All this meant another change of plan for Mr. Gorbachev. His hosts moved his meeting with Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng to a venue away from Tiananmen Square. And there was a separate session with Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang, the heir apparent to Deng Xiaoping. Mr. Zhao impressed with his confident manner here, whatever the undoubted tensions behind the scenes, as the hierarchy debate how to defuse the student challenge. By early evening, people power, Peking style, had reached a new peak in terms of size, intensity. There were signs of a cunning move by the Communist Party to seize control of the unofficial movement. A growing number of state organizations, including these police cadets, were marching to join the students. The point being, people now reckon it's politically safe to be seen to support them. Student leaders are claiming victory. Until this week, political reforms in China were in the doldrums. 4 days in May have changed that irrevocably. Brian Barron, BBC News, Peking.
Now that workers, party officials and journalists have joined the students in the square, the question is whether the protest has the momentum to become a mass movement spreading across the country. There are already reports that thousands of students have staged protest marches in 4 other major cities today. Brian Hanrahan in Peking has been examining the battle between the students and the authorities to win widespread support.
The ripples of unrest are starting to spread. For each activist in the square, there are many more, pedaling through the streets of Peking, risking the future vengeance of an angry Communist Party.
Going to march, Tiananmen Square. Why? I think this is my duty.
But the student cyclists are also starting to win support for their cause. This is becoming a battle for the public ear, and the students want to seek approval from a wider audience. China television has already yielded to their demand that the negotiations with the government on political reform should be televised. But now the students want the meetings in which they spell out their aims to be shown live. They don't trust the government.
The government is always very cunning. They was doing something very wicked. They always do something very wicked. Cut something off and make the television. People watch the television and think the government is very good, and students bad.
They complain that the Communist Party also slants the newspaper reports of the demonstrations. But the party, like the students, know that with the newspapers, they could be distributing ideas that would spread like an infection across the country. Information control has until now been one of the jealously guarded privileges of the Communist Party. But a new breed of Chinese journalists have been learning new techniques along with new technology. It's political reform that these modern minds want to see, and it's the unchecked corruption that even cautious observers believe could destroy the present political system.
Since those practices were tolerated by the government, so the people might rise against the government just on that account. In that sense, I think unbridled official corruption is really very dangerous for the nation.
So completely does the Communist Party control Chinese life that if any reform is to happen, it must be adopted by one of the factions inside the party itself. There is no independent political life here. And for the moment, the toleration being shown to the students suggests the factions are deadlocked, and behind the scenes, a great struggle is going on about China's future direction.
Here in Britain, the government has won the fight over its controversial leaflet on the community charge or poll tax. A week ago, the High Court said the leaflet was potentially misleading and the distribution of 21 million copies of it had to be stopped. Today, at a full hearing of the case, the court found in favour of the government and against the London Borough of Greenwich, which had challenged the leaflet.
The government's poll tax leaflet was launched last week by local government minister John Gummer. He said it was a fair and accurate account of the tax, putting right some of the misleading statements of Labour. But the next day, Labour-controlled Greenwich Council had turned the tables on him, winning a temporary injunction in the High Court to halt the leaflet on the grounds it was potentially misleading. In the Commons, John Gummer was lampooned by Labour as Postman Pat. In the full High Court hearing, which ended this afternoon, Stephen Sedley QC, counsel for Greenwich, had argued the leaflet was a misuse of ministerial power, littered with half-truths and omissions of fact. In particular, it failed to mention that married couples or people living together as man and wife were liable for each other's poll tax. But John Laws, for the government, said the intention of the leaflet was to cover only the main points about community charge in the run-up to registration for the tax, which begins officially next week. Joint liability wasn't mentioned because it wasn't relevant until much later. He denied the leaflet gave only the good news about poll tax and left out the bad. Dismissing Greenwich's application for a permanent ban on the leaflets, Lord Justice Wolfe said it was not for the courts to act as a critic or censor of government or anyone else. Anyone reading the leaflet, he said, would see it for what it was, an authoritative and balanced summary of the community charge. And readers were invited to apply for a further government booklet which does mention the question of joint liability. But despite the judgment, Labour believe the public will now see the government leaflet in a different light.
I think that people, in reading the leaflet, will make their own verdict, and I can't ask any more than that people judge whether they believe their money should have been spent on what we believe to be party political propaganda. They're paying the price of the leaflet, and eventually, of course, they're going to be paying the price of the poll tax.
There is nothing misleading in the leaflet at all. It is full of all the matters which people need to know about. It is concise, it is accurate.
The government say if Greenwich make an early appeal against today's ruling, they won't deliver the rest of the leaflets until the outcome is known.
A man who was one of the main voices of moderation in Lebanon has been murdered by a car bomb in Beirut. Sheikh Hassan Khaled was the leader of Lebanon's Sunni Muslim community. He held the title the Grand Mufti of the Republic. The car bomb went off in the Muslim west of Beirut and killed at least 20 other people. The BBC's Middle East correspondent Keith Graves reports.
Sheikh Hassan Khaled's heavily protected convoy was passing through a crowded residential area in the lunchtime rush hour when the bomb, quite clearly aimed at him, was detonated. Obviously without any consideration for the enormous casualties it would cause amongst passers-by. Even hardened rescue and first aid workers, used to the years of mindless carnage, were shocked by this one. It set fire to dozens of cars and caused widespread damage to buildings up to 100 yards away. The Grand Mufti, spiritual leader of Lebanon's 700,000 Sunni Muslims, was a conservative moderate, a man who preached understanding and reconciliation between the country's warring religious factions, a man listened to by those trying to end the years of violence in the country, and thus a target for those quite clearly intent on thwarting the peace moves. His death comes at a delicate time, with the fragile ceasefire in the fighting between the Syrians and their Muslim allies and the Christians just holding. Today's bomb will do nothing to maintain that situation. Keith Graves, BBC News in the Middle East.
Britain was in a minority of one against all the other European community countries today. The issue was whether Europe should dictate the wording of the health warnings on cigarette packets. 11 countries had no objection, but the British Health Secretary Kenneth Clarke said it wasn't a matter that Europe should concern itself with. The new warnings could start in 1993.
The Health Secretary, Kenneth Clarke, found no support among other member states for Mrs Thatcher's view that this was a subject Europe shouldn't be allowed to meddle in. All the other delegations agreed with the health warnings, which their individual parliaments won't be allowed to alter. Mr Clarke, assisted by a British diplomat casually smoking a cigarette, couldn't veto the plan because it comes in under the new system aimed at removing all trade barriers by 1992. Warnings on cigarette packets in Britain will have to be stronger. Among the suggestions, smoking can kill you and smokers die younger. The warnings will be on the front and the back of the packet instead of on the side as they are at present. And for the first time, all other tobacco products, including pipe tobacco and cigars, will have to carry warnings. Mr Clarke insisted he wasn't against the warnings as such.
I don't argue against strong warnings on tobacco packets, and I'm all in favour of giving very strong warnings indeed. The argument is whether the European community should design our warning labels for us, or whether the British government should be free to design its own. And we prefer to proceed by voluntary agreement with the tobacco industry, where it would be my intention to drive a hard deal, and also to give a say to the British Parliament and interest groups in Britain, like the BMA and others.
This is the first obvious sign of Mrs Thatcher's new tough line on Europe being put into effect. This was one of the issues in the pipeline when she spoke of those meddling Brussels bureaucrats. But many pro-Europeans will hear today's decision with dismay. They will see Britain as the odd man out, being dragged on reluctantly by other member states who are anxious to build a new kind of Europe. John Sargent, BBC News, Brussels.
Later in the programme, the voice of South Africa's white conscience takes a back seat. Helen Suzman, the scourge of apartheid, is to retire from Parliament. And why Britain is down in the dumps over waste disposal. Now the time is very nearly 6:15.
Tonight's headlines. Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping shook hands today on future friendship between the Soviet Union and China, ending 30 years of hostility. The government has won a High Court battle over its leaflets about the poll tax. The Labour-led borough of Greenwich had claimed they were misleading. Strict new health warnings on cigarette packets have been accepted by all EC countries, despite strong opposition from Britain. Health Secretary Kenneth Clarke thought the measures too interfering. The Hillsborough Public Inquiry has been hearing evidence from a number of football fans who were at the ground on the day of the disaster. One, who was on the terrace where 95 people died, said he heard people screaming for help, but the police didn't seem to take any notice. Another said he remembered being carried away from the terrace by a policeman just before he passed out. From Sheffield, our Home Affairs correspondent Neil Bennett.
Liverpool fans returned to Sheffield to recount the full horror of what happened on the Hillsborough terraces. They spoke of the growing pressure at the Leppings Lane end as more and more supporters crowded in. They fought for breath as around them the life was being crushed out of friends and fellow supporters. Ian Clark, a 16-year-old student, is still recovering from his injuries. He saw a mass of bodies entangled in each other. People were climbing over them to try to get out. Pointing to a model of the terraces, Mr. Clark said that towards the front he saw the body of a man lying face downwards, with the body of a little boy still on his shoulders. His arm was reaching out towards the gate in the perimeter fence. Keith Golding, aged 26, went to the match with 5 friends. One never returned to Liverpool. Mr. Golding said he thought he was going to die. Around him, on top of him and beneath him were people whose faces had turned purple, their lives clearly gone. He was dragged out by a fan and a police officer. But before that, supporters had been screaming and shouting to the police, "There's people dying here, we can't breathe." But it was as though police were trying to throw them back in again to prevent them getting onto the pitch. In tears, another supporter, 22-year-old David Cruz, told the Inquiry how a policeman tried unsuccessfully to revive a Liverpool fan. He pulled his T-shirt up to cover his face, but someone else pulled it back and tried once again to give him the kiss of life, unable to accept that the man was dead. After their evidence, the Liverpool fans boarded their coach back to Merseyside. It'll return tomorrow, bringing more supporters with more eyewitness accounts of the events at Hillsborough Football Ground.
Neil Bennett in Sheffield. The outbreaks of football violence at the weekend have brought a renewed pledge from Mrs. Thatcher of the government's determination to press ahead with its identity card scheme. She told the Commons of her disgust at the scenes at Crystal Palace on Saturday when Birmingham City fans rioted after invading the pitch. Those within football who are opposed to ID cards chose today to intensify their campaign against them.
Football, despite all its efforts, has found itself hijacked by the hooligan element it vociferously disowns, but which continues to target its games. These scenes at Crystal Palace's home match with Birmingham could not have come at a worse time for the game, with football desperately trying to recover from the devastating effects of the Hillsborough disaster. In the Commons this afternoon, the Prime Minister voiced her revulsion.
The scenes last Saturday, under which there are something like 220 arrests after Hillsborough, were absolutely appalling, utterly disgraceful, and we were all horrified by them. I believe it indicates that more steps need to be taken.
As Mrs. Thatcher was speaking, representatives of league clubs and their fans were in conference, most of them pleading with the government to abandon their plans for soccer ID cards. It wasn't the answer to either hooliganism or crowd control.
If it goes ahead, and it may very well be through the Prime Minister's pig-headedness it will do, that it will result in utter chaos. And I will make an even more dire forecast. I see Hillsborough dangers again and again and again.
The sport is becoming a ghetto sport. It's over-controlled, it's over-policed, it's undermanned by the supporters themselves, and I think it's heading for extinction.
From the clubs and from the fans, the message to the government is unmistakable. Ignore our views and football will never recover.
A drug that could halve the number of deaths from heart attacks was launched today. Every year, about 220,000 people in Britain suffer from heart attacks, and more than half of them die. The new drug, known as the clotbuster, could drastically reduce this number because it's far quicker and easier to administer than similar treatments. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson explains.
David Rees is having a heart attack. 2 hours ago, he was driving a bus. Then he felt pains in his chest and his left arm went numb. But he's one of the luckier patients. The earlier treatment can be started after a heart attack, the greater the chances of survival. And Mr. Rees is about to receive treatment to reverse his heart attack. Heart attacks are caused when the blood clots and blocks a vessel in the wall of the heart. It robs the heart muscle of oxygen and the muscle is damaged. There are several drugs available which can dissolve clots and stop heart attacks, but most have to be given in an infusion over a period of an hour or so. From today, a new drug has become available in Britain called Eminase, which should improve the chances of prompt and effective treatment.
Mr. Rees, you're having a heart attack. It's come on just within the last few hours. What we'd like to give you is treatment to dissolve the clot that you have, occluding...
The new treatment is given by injection, lasting about 5 minutes. Already, ambulance men are being trained to give the drug so that treatment can be started in the patient's own home. Special guidelines are being drawn up to help ambulance men towards a correct diagnosis before they give the drug. Treatment with drugs which dissolve clots, known as clotbusters, can reduce the death rate from heart attacks by 50%.
Really, we need to get patients within the first hour of having a heart attack, and that should be possible if we had proper patient education, education of the public, and education of general practitioners and hospital doctors. But as it is in many areas, it takes 6 or 8 hours to get a patient into hospital, and then we're only treating the survivors of heart attacks, and that doesn't do anybody very much good.
The new drug is very much more expensive than existing drugs, but doctors hope that because it can be given as an injection, it should lead to a considerable improvement in the outlook for heart attack patients.
The woman who's been described by admirers as the conscience of white South Africa and by President Botha as Mother Superior is retiring after 36 years as an MP. At 71, Helen Suzman wants to make way for younger people. Once the lone voice of dissent in an all-white parliament, she's won worldwide acclaim for her opposition to apartheid and her support for civil rights.
The most respected white champion of black rights, Helen Suzman's name has been chanted in the townships alongside Nelson Mandela. And for the past 36 years, Parliament has been only one of Mrs. Suzman's platforms to condemn apartheid and the violence of its imposition.
These disastrous confrontations between the people of the townships, the police and the army must stop. The killings must stop.
As a frequent critic of the police, Mrs. Suzman was especially effective because she liked to confront directly the policemen she accused of abusing their powers.
Well, may I ask why we've waited for an hour to see you, General, if you were not prepared to talk to us? You know, we are 6 members of Parliament, busy people.
Helen Suzman has been busy fighting apartheid in the White Parliament ever since the signs of rigid racial segregation first appeared nearly 40 years ago. Arriving at Parliament today, Mrs. Suzman was modest about her achievements, but certain about what she leaves undone.
The disappearance of apartheid, of course. I mean, there have been many changes, and a number of important laws have in fact been repealed. Laws that I opposed when they were introduced, and that's a source of considerable satisfaction to me, though I don't take credit.
Mrs Sussman's retirement coincides with that of President Botha, her long-time adversary. She hopes a new generation of South African politicians will cherish not his ideals but hers. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
And further north in Africa, the military are out in force in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa after reports of an attempted coup. Tanks have been deployed in the streets of the capital and around the airport, and fighter planes have flown over the city. The Ethiopian president is believed to be out of the country on a state visit to East Germany.
Home again now, and there's been a call to ban the import and burial of thousands of tons of other countries' domestic rubbish. A House of Lords Select Committee has said the government's plans for dealing with waste are a shambles. The committee wants stringent new laws for disposing of everything from household waste to hazardous chemicals.
Giant deodorant sprays sweeten the air at one of South Yorkshire's biggest council dumps on the outskirts of Rotherham. This, say the council, is well-managed, environmentally friendly waste disposal. But local experts are worried they can't impose the same standards on private dumps or on the companies which create much of the waste.
Our legislation on waste disposal, waste management is defective. It needs to be improved. Government up till now has been tinkering with the legislation. Government is not giving us proper powers.
A few miles from the Rotherham dump, methane gas, created by domestic refuse, is funneled out of a sealed landfill site. This is the kind of safety measure the Lords Committee would like to see enforced at all similar sites. Otherwise, as they put it, the threat to local people is explosive. The committee also called for a ban on the 130,000 tonnes of European domestic waste dumped in Britain every year. They say it exposes the public to unnecessary risk and nuisance.
Industry depends on there being public confidence in the disposal of waste to operate. And if we lose public confidence, and the public say, not in my backyard under any circumstances, industry would be in a very serious problem.
At Kirksandall, near Doncaster, exactly that kind of problem is building up, as local people object to a plan to build an incinerator plant for toxic waste on a site close to a housing estate. Lords Committee members want local waste authorities to have stronger planning and monitoring powers to help quell legitimate public fears. They say they're dismayed at the lack of government action to bring it about.
Britain's biggest ever takeover bid looks as though it will fail. An American judge has refused to lift the injunction which is blocking the takeover of the British mining company Kongsgold by the South African-controlled Minorco Group. The bid, which expires tomorrow, was for £3.5 billion.
Finally, a British explorer, Robert Swan, has been celebrating at the North Pole after becoming the first man to walk to both ends of the Earth. 3 years ago, he went to the South Pole. This time, he led a team of 8 from Resolute in the far north of Canada to Cape Columbia and then across the ice to the North Pole. They reached their destination on Sunday but couldn't be picked up by planes then because of bad weather. They covered 600 miles in just 8 weeks.
From the edge of the Arctic Circle to the roof of the world. Sometimes they walked for 18 hours a day in temperatures well below freezing across a constantly moving ocean of ice. Members of the support team have now arrived at the North Pole to congratulate Robert Swan and his international team of walkers. As well as him, there's one other Briton, an American, a Canadian, a German, an Australian and a Japanese, planting the flag of the United Nations on the North Pole. And now, luxuries of the sort they weren't able to carry with them.
Oh, yes.
Behind the celebrations, the serious point to the trip was to draw attention to pollution damage in the ozone layer and the greenhouse effect which threatens to melt the ice caps.
Look at our story as a small example, there's lots of other ones, and say, well, those people came together, took on the elements, didn't give up and won. What we've got to do as a world is do the same.
Now, Robert Swan says his ice-walking adventures are over. He says 2 poles are enough for me.
And that was the 6 o'clock news on Tuesday, the 16th of May. China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, greeted Mikhail Gorbachev and told him that together their countries must end the past and open up the future.
Britain alone opposed a European plan for standard slogans on cigarette packets. The Health Secretary said the British government and the British Parliament should be free to decide on our own warnings.
And Robert Swan, who walked to the South Pole 3 years ago and who's just walked to the North Pole, said, "My next job is going to be in the Bahamas." That's it from Anna and from me. Good night.
Good evening to you. With high pressure set to dominate the weather over the next few days, that means it's going to be basically dry with lots of sunshine and quite warm too. But of course it wouldn't be British weather if there weren't a few hiccups. Here's the first one, not all that important, but it is carrying some cloud. It may give the odd shower this afternoon and evening, and there could be some patchy drizzly rain down into the southwest. The one up here just to the west of Scotland, that's a more important feature. That's going to run right across Scotland, bringing a good deal of cloud and some showery rain tonight and at first tomorrow. We can pick up those features on the satellite sequence during today. Here's the first one as it comes south. It gives some patchy rain, 1 or 2 showers, nothing of any importance. But you can see out to the west here, much more in the way of cloud, and that's going to run its way in towards Scotland during the next 24 hours. So this evening then, 1 or 2 showers down in the south, perhaps some drizzly rain in the southwest, most places bright and sunny. The showers over Scotland tending to die out, but already the cloud in the west is thickening up, and there's some rain got into the Western Isles as well. Let's have a look at that rain tonight. Most of it's going to come to Scotland. It'll mostly clear right through during the course of the night, and then tomorrow there'll be some patchy rain around at first and then more right out into the west waiting. Down in the southwest here, well, there could be some patchy drizzle, particularly around some of these coasts. Temperatures tonight, well, in the south, it'll be fairly cloudy. It'll stay mild. The temperatures there are no lower than about 9. The same will be true in the west and north, because here there'll be quite a bit of cloud and strong wind as well. But anyway, from central Scotland down to the Midlands, the temperatures could drop to around about 3. Could be just a touch of ground frost and 1 or 2 mist and fog patches as well. There's tomorrow's weather chart. High pressure, and here we've got the frontal system strung out across central Scotland. So fairly cloudy up here at first. There could be some patchy rain around as well. Some brightness in the north with 1 or 2 showers. Over England and Wales, basically dry and bright. Quite a bit of cloud perhaps around in the south at first, and more especially down in the southwest. And some of that thicker cloud with some drizzly rain could work its way up and along the Irish Sea. But most places dry, bright and quite sunny. And the rain in Scotland and the thicker cloud tending to work its way northwards, with the rain going up that western coast. Most places tomorrow will in fact turn out to be warmer, as high as 21 again down in the southeast, a little bit cooler in the north. That's it from me.